I'm Joe. I'm from Portland. I teach classes on hardware hacking. I'm not the tall Joe. I'm the short Joe, though. So this is going to be Rethinking DMA Attacks with Erebus, and this is a pretty hardware-focused talk. Erebus is a tool that I'm working on that I'll go into a little more detail about, but it's got a lot more purposes than just memory acquisition, but I have a feeling that's what you're most interested to hear. This is me. I'm Joe. I've been dealing with hardware stuff. I actually just updated this slide this morning to 20+ years of fun with hardware because I realized it's been that long. And I do training on like embedded systems, x86 systems, and I have plenty of unconventional theories to share. Not here, but asking about them later. And that's me dressed up as at LabsCon, which has a cybercrime / meme warfare gala, and that's me in my meme costume. So this is PCI Express. Who's heard of PCI Express before? Awesome, we're in good shape. Now, you might notice, like, wait, that doesn't look like PCI Express. Well, the card that's in the slot that you can't see is PCI Express. The slot down at the bottom is PCI, the predecessor to PCI Express. PCI Express was designed to be a high-speed interconnect between devices. It was mostly used for cards, but that's kind of changing, as we will see. There is some prior art in this room. And I actually had this picture in here before Joe showed the exact same picture this morning. Tribble, which is a PCI DMA attack device using that old PCI interface on this giant card with an extra hard drive and a lot of stuff going on. People then kind of have gone through different iterations of how we can use different devices for DMA. FireWire was an issue for a long time. I say spanning 2 different millennia because it actually has been working since the 90s. And yeah, so you could plug a FireWire device cable between 2 devices and copy memory from one to the other, which is great if you want to copy memory, which is bad if you're trying to hide things in memory, which is great if your job is to try to find people hiding things in memory. So it's a lot of back and forth. I'm going to talk a little bit about my procrastination. Because in 2014, I had looked back and seen Tribble and other work that people were doing, and it's like, wait, why are we using a DMA cable? A FireWire cable. Why don't we just slot something directly into the slot? And that was Slot Screamer, which was a little device using an off-the-shelf chip. And basically, I lied to this device, configured it wrong, so that it showed up as a configurable, programmable via USB PCI Express device. It could go and read and write memory in a system just by being slotted into that system. Ulf Frisk took that and ran with it and made PCI Leech. How many of you are familiar with PCI Leech? Okay. How many of you use PCI Leech on a regular basis? Okay. Have ever touched PCI Leech? Okay. Good to know. And that kind of turned into, led to limitations of that chip. So they went and did an FPGA implementation on a Xilinx dev board. And then there's been some other work, Thunderclap, Thunderspry, and others that have kind of poked and prodded at PCI Express overall, but as well in the focus on, I still have 40 minutes left. Sorry, I'm just looking at the time and realizing it's not ticking. That's okay. Now it's ticking. We're good. And yeah, we'll talk more about that in a moment. But if we want to attack something via PCI Express, we need to connect some hardware, right? We need to get that device enumerated. We have to be able to bus master, which means we need to have permissions to go and read and write stuff. And then we do the reading and writing to memory, and then we present about it at FTSCon. So connecting the hardware, there's a whole lot of adapters out there that are right off the shelf, just work. What's really interesting is these came to be much more common as people wanted to put more GPUs into system to do either hash cracking or Bitcoin mining or other cryptocurrency mining, because you had one system and it had one PCI Express slot, but you wanted to put 15 graphics cards in it. You don't need the bandwidth between those, but you do need the adapters, so you can get these adapters really cheap, which is kind of great. 10 years ago, I had to build my own adapters, which is this. Where'd mouse go? Wake up. There we are. This guy over here. Ah. My mousing skills are low. Yeah, so all that to circle something. It showed up on the screen, right? Yeah. So I built that one 10 years ago. It was actually one of my first PCBs that I ever designed. You might think, oh, PCI Express, that's like fast. You have to be careful with. Nah, don't worry about it. Just fab the board, get it done, hook it up, and if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, then you can worry about the problems. And again, I was looking for functionality. I just wanted to get it to work. I didn't really care about signal integrity or reliability. So you can fudge that. But then other people started making these boards, which made it a lot easier to adapt things. So step 2 is getting it enumerated. We need to hook up and get identified by the system. PCI Express kind of has this hierarchy where we want to put a device in here that's going to be an endpoint, and we want our endpoint to be connected to either a switch or directly to the root complex so we can go and access memory. That's where the good stuff is. The process of enumeration has to happen before the device can do anything. Typically that happens when the system boots, so you might have to plug into a system and reboot the system. Now we've got a lot more hot plug PCI Express type things like Thunderbolt and some other interfaces we'll talk about where the system reserves regions so you can plug a PCI Express device into a booted system and it'll go and say, oh, something showed up, we'll assign this device number whatever on bus whatever. So once you're enumerated, then we can actually look and see from software, LSPCI, like, oh, yeah, we've got our device connected. This is actually where we have our two Thunderbolt controllers right here, these two empty spots, waiting for us to plug something malicious in. Here's where we have other devices. We have an NVMe SSD, a SD card controller, and a Wi-Fi adapter, also plugged into PCI Express slots. And now we want to read and write memory. The busmaster thing is interesting. It's more of an older PCI issue because PCI Express is point-to-point. I am on one device, and you are the root complex. I can say whatever I want. You just can ignore it if you don't like it. So I have a bunch of commands I can do, like a memory read, a memory write, an IO read, and IO write. We don't really need to worry about the details of these because all that matters is memory read and memory write. If we can read memory, we can do our forensics, right? We can forensicate all over the place. And if we can write to memory, we can do our attacks. We can do our malicious stuff and sneak in and cheat at games, which is the real reason for using this hardware. That's the real market for this hardware. Right now, people spend thousands of dollars for DMA devices to cheat at games. And they'll either do the stupid stuff where they'll like turn off the walls or like change the number of bullets they have. But all the game companies are getting really good. They have like basically game companies are doing better EDR than some of the EDR companies, and detecting that people are putting malicious hardware in their system and doing all sorts of bad stuff. So now what people are doing is they're read-only DMA attacks, where they're reading memory, feeding it over to a separate system where they're playing the exact same game, populating the memory with the real characters, and then doing the tweaks to that game, like turning off the walls, and then combining those two video screens to see one thing where you can ghost one screen over the other. So people will spend thousands of dollars just so they can cheat in games. I don't know why. Does anybody here cheat in games? Never. Yeah. I mean, it's fun to set up and see that you can do it, but I don't understand about like going and buying a setup to do it. Whatever. The moral of the story, though, is PCI Express is permissive by design. And that's really beneficial if you're someone who wants to get memory extraction. It's really not beneficial if you're someone who wants to hide stuff in memory. So I have my DMA attack taxonomy. I made this up. Basically, tethered attacks, drive-by attacks, and embedded attacks. So when we think of tethered attack, this is where you've got your system running, and you probably have it in a case or something, but you're going to hook a cable up, and you're going to plug this thing in, and we've got a giant board that's probably taking up a lot of space. And this is where you might sit there and do some inspection on the device. You might interact with it. Like, you're set up, and you're there permanently. I think of drive-by attacks where you're going to plug into a system, hook something in, make a modification to memory, and then you walk away and you're done, right? Like it's kind of like more of a malicious patching, a lock screen bypass type thing, something like that. And then the embedded option, this is actually Pico the board on top is Pico EVB. The project was Pico DMA, which basically took this FPGA board and made a tiny, tiny, tiny little device you could put into a system with either a Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or LTE module so that you could remotely do some DMA attacks, which seems pretty cool. But the idea being you embed it in the system and you leave it there, and then you do your attacks. So kind of to summarize this, we've got like short-term stuff where we want quicks. That's the hot plug, that's the drive-by attacks. The long-term where we're going to actually open the system up, reboot maybe a few times, that's the embedded. And in between, we kind of have those tethered attacks where we hook up and do something, but we're not sure what. So there's some size issues, though. You'll notice that this is a micro ATX motherboard, and the FPGA, the PCI Leech FPGA on the right is bigger than like some motherboards, so it's kind of an issue. Also, we've got some IP issues. A lot of the devices that are using FPGAs are using vendor IP cores for PCI Express implementations, which technically are not licensed for the vendor that's using them. The whole process of getting a license from Xilinx or Altera or Lattice is expensive. The idea being if you are designing a product, you're supposed to pay for it. But PCI Leech, it's open source, so you can go and get your own license to the tools and build your own bitstream, as opposed to doing what everyone does, which is just download the compiled synthesized bitstream and using it. So continuing my procrastination, 2021 we finally had a schematic figured out. We started working on the PCB. We finally got the PCBs manufactured and made a test jig, and then a year after assembling test jig, we assembled a board. So we actually have a little board now for over a year, actually. No, almost a year, just under a year. And now we still need to profit. This has been a back burner project for a decade for me, basically. The problem with back burner projects is you never work on them. I don't work on the other projects either, but this one is definitely a back burner project. So this is Erebus. It's got a Lattice ECP5 FPGA. Its full name is EPIC Erebus because EPIC is an anagram of PCIe. And Erebus, you're here to RE the bus. You know, hey, jokes. Looking a little closer, we've got this FPGA, which takes up basically the entire board. There's two different gate sizes, so we can get like the cheap version and the expensive version. They have the same pinout. Over here we have DRAM, which is a very special, one single manufacturer makes these like really compacted DRAM modules that basically does away with a lot of the overhead, which is pretty great. Up top we have a high density connector. This will be for a USB 3 connection. And it actually can even work if we wanted to on the higher end FPGA. We could do a second PCI Express link, so we could do man-in-the-middle issues. And then a USB 2.0 over here. We also have some pads here. We can pop on an 8 GB storage that's like built in, so we can have some storage bit on the device as well as RAM. You can basically run Linux on your hardware implant. On the back, there's not much there. The one thing we have is this SD card slot. And that's an optional thing, because sometimes you'll need a single-sided board. You don't want to have any extra stuff over there. But it's kind of pretty cool, because if you can imagine an attack device that does memory dumps that has 2 terabytes of storage just like stuck on the back, that could be pretty cool. So we've got a test jig that we've been working with so far. And I'll talk more about the state of the project. We do have lights flashing. That's the important thing. So if lights flash, then at least it powers on. There's the high-speed clocking thing we have to figure out. We'll talk about more. And eventually, at some point, this is going to be a product. And I'll talk about like some of my motivations there in a while. But yeah, I teach classes. I want a tool to do this in classes. And the giant FPGA versions of PCI Leech aren't sufficient for what I want to do. So basically, I build the tools I want to use for my classes, and then other people apparently have uses for them too. So eventually, it'll be there. But again, back burner project. So what are the motivations for actually doing it, what I'm trying to get at about like rethinking platform security. So PCI Express is everywhere. It's in a lot more places than it used to be. One of the use cases that I really wanted was embedded periodic dumps. Right? I want to be able to pop this thing into a system, leave it there, and get it to dump memory, and then get it to dump memory again, and then maybe the next day dump memory again, and then a day, a week, a month, a year later, I can go and retrieve it and have like all this like history of what happened in the system. That's not something that any of the existing platforms really have support for, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be possible. Theoretically, I should be able to rewrite the firmware for an NVMe drive to do this as well, but that's another project entirely. If you think about most systems, they're on the order of like 32 gigabytes of RAM, some less, some more. The DRAM on the board itself is only 256 megabytes, which is just enough for like buffering and caching as it writes stuff. There is the SD card, which can store up to 2 terabytes. And also there's a spot on there we can throw another chip that would store up to 8 gigabytes. So we have some places to store stuff. But basically what that means, we could fit easily about 64 dumps into this SD card before we have to go and retrieve it. And as time goes on, the SD cards are going to get more dense, and we'll probably have a 4 terabyte card at some point. I think a couple companies have announced them, but I don't know if anybody is shipping them yet. But if we think about some of the constraints there, like, okay, we can just compress those, right? Because it's memory, right? The contents of memory, unless you've got like a paged, compressed ZRAM type system where you're compressing your paged out memory, you're going to be able to compress anywhere from 3 to 10x the data you're ripping off there. The other thing is, if you've got the same system you're dumping over and over again, there's going to be a lot of duplication. So if we can get some deduplication going on while we're doing that, we should be able to get as much as like 10x improvement over that. So instead of like 640 dumps, we're like talking maybe 1,000, maybe 10,000, somewhere in that range would be pretty cool. Because then you can theoretically do it like every hour instead of having to do it like once a day, every hour for a year. The other thing we talk about is the interfaces. A lot of people who do forensics really want the dumps to happen really fast. And that makes sense, because you don't want to sit there waiting for memory to dump off. The board that I'm using is, actually I should take the board out so I can show it to you, but it's in my wallet, which is in my bag, so I'm not going to get it out right now. You'll see a picture again. It's got 2 PCI Express lanes, and they can go up to 5 gigahertz, which is PCI Express Gen 2. So the max throughput this thing could possibly do in a system is 1 gigabyte per second of dumping memory, which is pretty good. The minimum it'll do is one lane, Gen 1 speeds, which would be 250 megabytes per second, also pretty good. But then you need to get that data out somewhere. So if we're writing to the SD card, our limit is 104 megabytes per second. Again, if we compress it, we can probably get some better performance, more data on there. And a lot of devices, USB high speed is going to be 48 megabytes per second or somewhere in that range, and USB super speed is going to be more like 500 megabytes per second. So a lot of people will want that USB super speed, 500 megabytes per second, to get all the data off as fast as you can. But again, if we consider that we can, what's it called? We can't compress the PCI Express host link, right? We can't go any faster from dumping memory, but we can actually go and compress all the other stuff. We can compress what we put in an SD card. We can also compress what we put over USB. And if we're deduplicating as well, it should be feasible to use a USB 2.0 link to get the data off of the device as fast as we can read it. Theoretically, fingers crossed. I'll have to actually do it before I can make that claim with authority. Also, if you know what type of system you've got, if you've got like a Windows or a Linux system, you can have a reference image on Erebus and deduplicate against that, so you don't have to send all the stuff that isn't different. You can just streamline your USB interface. The reason for the USB 2.0 versus 3.0 is the cost of the device. I have a lot of ideas for what to use this for, including selling them to gamers who want to spend money and win games, and also to game manufacturers who want to detect these devices, because might as well play both sides. But again, a cheaper device is cheaper to make and higher margins, right? That's the goal, right? So Erebus in the middle is another scenario that I'd like to kind of play around with. Pardon me. There is a project someone is working on where they're basically taking the PCI Leech firmware and adding a NVMe implementation. So instead of plugging this in your system, and it looks like you have a PCI Leech in your system, which is kind of a red flag if you have Epic Mega Games EDR on your system, then it it shows up as an NVMe drive, which is supposed to be in your system, which is not going to be detected. And the thing is, if you've got a device that's actually behaving as an NVMe device, that's a good thing. If you legitimately have a real NVMe device on the other side, and you have Erebus as like a bridge in between them, you have an even better opportunity, because you really do have a legitimate device, and you can go and inject some additional reads and writes in between, or modify what you need to. And Erebus has that. Where's the picture? There we go. Oh, where? Sorry, that little connector up there, that tiny connector. That's a high-density connector. We can actually throw extra PCI Express lanes over that, so we'll have to have a carrier card where you plug your third-party device in, you plug this in between, you plug a cable in between, then you plug this whole monstrosity into a system. But we should be able to get it to be the size of like a NVMe drive, which is 28 by 80 millimeters for all that. Let's get back to where we were. Okay, so if we're going to do drive-by DMA attacks, Thunderbolt is actually decently secured at this point in time. You can't just walk up to most systems and plug a Thunderbolt device in and have it enumerate and get memory access without some extra work. So how are we going to find ways to get in? Perhaps you've already figured these out, but Oculink is this new thing that gamers want. Gamers drive a lot of technology, it seems. So instead of Thunderbolt, which is a bit pricey and has some bandwidth bottlenecks and latency issues, people are adding GPUs to their systems by having this Oculink port, which is basically a high-speed storage cable connector being repurposed as like an external PCI Express device. Now, external PCI Express, 10 years ago, we had Thunderbolt. Thunderbolt was completely wide open. Anybody could plug a device in, enumerate it, and do stuff. And over time, basically, Mac OS in 2014, there's a teen in there somewhere. In 2014, Mac OS kind of sealed up Thunderbolt for the most part. And then it was I believe 2018 and 2019 that Linux and Windows finally caught on the bandwagon and realized, hey, you shouldn't be able to just plug a Thunderbolt device in and get full access to all of the memory, which may be a bad thing for some of you who wanted that memory access. So, oops. So here we got this. Actually, this is not the laptop I'm presenting from right now. This one has a little spot for a second NVMe drive, but you can pop that out, put an adapter in, and here I've got my Oculink cable to my Oculink dock with my giant GPU in there, which replace this giant GPU with a tiny little malicious device. We've got basically PCI Express access to the system. Oftentimes, these are not labeled as external ports, which means that Windows does not use its kernel DMA protection and other things on them, which is probably a mistake in my opinion. But there's more stuff with PCI Express these days coming out. Anybody ever used a CF Express or an SD Express card? So CF Express has been around for a little while longer, and then previously to that was XQD. Both of these use PCI Express. You pop it in, it shows up as an NVMe drive. Has anybody ever played an Xbox? Yeah, they have CF Express cards. Their memory card that they plug in the back, the reason they're so expensive is because it's a high-speed NVMe drive. It's the same mechanical connector as CF Express. Nikon Z7, Z6, and a bunch of other cameras now use that as well. And SD Express, who has a Switch 2? Anybody? Whose kids have a Switch 2? Who's heard of the Switch 2? It's a game console, not a networking piece of networking equipment. So Switch 2 is the first device you can buy that has an SD Express slot. And so, of course, I had to get one as a work expense. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But yeah, so looking at this camera, right? This is a camera. It's made by Nikon. They have some custom silicon that's, I believe, manufactured by Sony. But it is, and they have some off-the-shelf silicon as well. But if you think about it, like, if Windows and Mac and Linux are having a hard time figuring out how to secure PCI Express, do you think Nikon did a good job? Yeah. Not to judge them, but like, yeah. So the adapters and the connectors are pretty basic. Basically, this is a what is this device? I should skip this slide. Yeah, here's the one where I actually put, this is Slot Screamer, the old mini PCI attack device, plugged into an adapter, plugged into my camera, and it says, oh, cannot access this memory card, insert another card. However, what has to happen for us to get this card? We have to connect it, we have to plug it in, it has to detect that a device is there, it has to recognize that it's a memory card of some sort, and it probably has to realize that it's not compatible. All of that has to happen after it has enumerated. So we've already done it. We need to physically connect, we need to enumerate, and then we need to read and write memory. And so if the device can talk to us, we can go and issue our reads and writes, which we will not talk more about that now because it's still work in progress. But yeah, cameras are computers, and they did not have an IOMMU installed. SD Express, exploring the same way. If I were to look at some off-the-shelf SD Express card readers, what's interesting to me is they have like this little chip here that is the SD Express, Realtek manufactured SD Express interface chip, but basically it goes to an NVMe controller. So basically you take your SD Express to NVMe to USB to go and read and write. So we've got some layers of chips that work off the shelf to give us access to this data. But more importantly, I've made a few adapters and poked around a bit. It turns out that Nintendo Switch does use an IOMMU. Does anybody know what an IOMMU is? So basically, it isolates different memory devices from different. It isolates different devices from each other in terms of accessing memory. Instead of plugging in a graphics card and it going directly to your host CPU, you can plug it in and it can go to a VM that's running Windows. So you can have like a Windows VM that has a graphics card and it thinks it's a host graphics card, and Windows thinks it's directly talking to it. So you're kind of virtualizing the PCI Express slot into a VM. Does that make sense? But what you can also do is you can basically like firewall these things off. You isolate them into a VM that doesn't exist, and suddenly the device can't talk to the rest of the system. It's a feature. It exists. It exists on nearly every CPU for 20 years, but people didn't start using it until like 5 years ago for security purposes. So another thing I want to do with Erebus is full stack manipulation of PCI Express. PCI Leech is using Xilinx's off-the-shelf reference implementation, which requires licensing IP cores, which is a bunch of work and money. It also means you're not supposed to change those. And so you can change the vendor ID so you can show up as if you're a device manufactured by Broadcom or Apple or Intel or someone else. But what you can't do is change a lot of the lower level details of what functional type of device it is and how it responds to some special vendor-defined messages in some cases. So I'd like the ability to go and do all the things you're not supposed to do in the protocol, which, as we all know, like that's how you make protocols break, is you do the things you're not supposed to do that no one has ever tried to do before. There are also a bunch of PCI Express features that are supposed to be security that may or may not work so well. But there's not a device out there that really lets you test these great. So one of these is called ATS, Address Translation Services. And it basically is a performance improvement. So it basically lets your device say, hey, I'm in a VM. I know where the VM is. We already talked about this. I'm going to cache the address that I'm talking to. And then I'm going to set a bit and say, hey, this is a cached address. Just give me the data at this address. And so typically, if you had your IOMU would prevent your device from talking outside of its domain. This basically says, hey, this is the address I want to talk to, which is the mapped address outside the domain. But if you set that bit and you just send it, then does the host trust you or not? It turns out they just used a couple bits that were left over in the header, AT, the pin bit 3 and bit 2. And we can either have an untranslated request, which is the default, zeros, a translation request, which is like, hey, I want you to take my virtual address and give me the physical address, and a translated request, which is, hey, here's my physical address. Give me the data at this address. You already told me it was OK. I pinky swear promise. And actually, some of this text has been added more recently because the additional security features did not exist when they first implemented this feature. So it's basically the bypass your IOMU bit. The features they added were called ACS, Access Control Services, which maps down to basically 7 bits on a device, on a switch. And basically, they have abbreviation letters, T, E, U, C, R, B, and V. What do those mean? Basically, source validation, transaction blocking. If you think about a network, right? If you send a packet and say, hey, go turn on the lights, and this packet is coming from my IP address, which is 192.168.1.1, or no, it's going to be like, whatever. Don't worry about that. Then what we can do with source validation is like, well, actually, is your packet coming from you? You said it came from you, but you're actually on network 10 dot something else. So maybe that isn't actually you and the local computer doing anything. You might think this is basic. This is an extended feature of PCI Express that you have to turn on to make it work properly because it didn't exist when all this started. So 7 different features, all are about like basic networking. Things that you might want to do, but applied to PCI Express. The problem is, does your system support it? If your system supports it, did you turn it on? If you turned it on, then does it actually work? Has anybody actually tested it? Because does anybody have the hardware to go and do all the violations that it's supposed to be preventing? Or does your vendor actually tell you to turn it off because it affects performance? And this is NVIDIA saying that basically NVIDIA recommends that the system BIOS disable access control services to ensure maximum peer-to-peer bandwidth between GPUs. So if you've got a bunch of GPUs in your system, NVIDIA says turn it off, don't use this, just trust everything, because it's easier that way. Anyway, a little bit more about Open PCI Express implementation. AMD/Xilinx has their implementation that you can go and pay them to use. Lattice has one as well. Lattice is the chip that I'm using, a Lattice ECP5 chip. And the price, if you want to know, it says contact sales. Do you know what that means? It's expensive. So yeah, whoops. So the point is, you ever have projects that get more projects? Yeah, so this is a project that's getting more projects, and that one of those projects is implementing an open source PCI Express implementation, where there's a lot of pieces that have already been done that are open source. We just actually have to put them all together to go and basically do PCI Express without using vendor code, without using licensed IP. Of course, what's going to happen as soon as we finish this is like everyone who's paying for all those licensed IP blocks is probably going to say, oh, wow, there's a free one. Let's try that. And you know what happens when hobby projects turn into critical infrastructure. Yay. So sorry in advance. But yeah, so this is a definite scope creep of the project, and probably one of the biggest reasons why I've been talking about it for 10 years, and I don't have a demo right now. But a little bit more. I feel like I missed a slide. Sorry. I've got the whole like, what this isn't going to solve. Did I put my slides out of order? So, let's see. I've talked about all the things I want to do with it. I've talked about the device itself. I should talk about the state of the device. So, what this isn't going to solve. So, people have been talking for at least a decade, probably more like 2 decades, about secure PCI Express devices, secure USB devices, thinking that like they're going to actually make it so that you can only use correct devices, mostly for anti-counterfeiting measures. And to some degree, that can work. Having a whole process where you plug a device in, you enumerate it, then you do check certificates, signatures, challenge response, all that crypto crap. Yeah, you can go and verify that you have a legitimate device. But in the scenario where you're trying to do memory acquisition, right? Yes, I have that real device, that legitimate device, and we are actually going to go and do that whole verification process. But if I'm Erebus sitting there in the middle of that whole transaction. Once the verification has happened, right, it's just a normal device. I have not seen any examples of actual encryption in use, in operation. Like they're not encrypting the link, they're just verifying the device that's in there is the real one. So if we can man in the middle it, if we can go and, or clone it, but that's another project entirely, which, projects. Yeah. So it's not going to solve that. But again, I don't know anybody who's doing that now. I do know that some very vertically integrated companies that make computers and phones are doing device authentication, but again, they're not doing encrypted communications between the device. And if you haven't noticed already, like my end goal might be a little different than some of yours. My actual end goal is that I don't want DMA to happen, right? So I know you all want your memory dumps, and I'm building hardware to make memory dumps, and that's probably why I'm here. And hopefully, like while it works, and that's great. But my personal motivation is that there's no reason why all these operating system vendors should be shipping hardware that doesn't use the basic functionality to protect against memory dumping, right? So that's my soapbox talk. I'll move on. So in terms of status and plan, and I don't recall if this time includes questions or not. So we have a hardware clocking issue. If we were to look back at the device, let me go back to the big picture. We connect over PCI Express to this device. Mouse. And Lattice makes this chip, and they sell an IP block, and they give some reference designs. And this chip works great at PCI Express 1.0 speeds, 2.5 gigahertz. And then they have a new version, the 5G version, which works at 5 gigahertz, which is the PCI Express 2.0 speeds. And it's actually the exact same silicon. They just test them and find the ones that work faster and charge it more for them. But one thing that doesn't actually work well is PCI Express is supposed to have a reference clock. It's a 100 megahertz clock, which seems pretty slow compared to everything else these days. And this device does not want to work at 5 gigahertz with only a 100 megahertz reference clock. So it actually doesn't comply with the PCI Express specification at all. So we have to work around that, which means we have to add a component on here. And actually, I should put a picture of the rework. We basically got the clock generator chip and glued it to the top of that chip and soldered a bunch of wires jumping around, which you would think would be a problem at speeds like that, but totally works fine. So we do need to figure out where on this board to fit another chip or two, which there's not a lot of room, because it has to go on the top because we want it to be a single-sided board. So like basically, it's going to have to fit in somewhere right around here, but that's the challenge now, is to figure out how to do that. In terms of other things, our PCI Express stack is in progress. There's some prior work on getting the lowest level TLPs working, and so we're building off of that. And actually, just last week, has anybody heard of NLnet? It's like a Dutch, I think, group that actually owned an IP block, and then they sold it, and now they use the funds to give grants to people who want to do open source hardware projects, which is kind of great. So NLnet is funding another group which is going to start working on some open PCI Express stuff, so hopefully we'll sync up with them, but that was literally last week that I heard about it, so I need to follow up. We have an architect for our architecture design for like kind of the system on chip, the soft core, which is a CPU that we synthesize on the FPGA, and a bootloader system, so that this thing, when you plug it in, it'll come up into this early state. It'll decide whether you're in a device in use, whether you are hooked up on a test bench with USB or something else, just so we don't have to have everybody use this giant test jig, wherever we have the picture of the test jig. Come on, test jig. There we go. So everybody doesn't have to use this thing. They can literally just put it into a system and program it, or they can hook up a USB cable on the other end on these connectors over here, so that this big chunky board with extra hardware can just be a dev board and not a production use board. So yeah, we have that architected. Once we've got some more solid PCI Express stuff working, then we'll kind of work on moving into that. So some thanks. We got some prior art and inspiration. Thanks, Kingpin. I don't know who he is, but I think his handle's Kingpin. Metalstorm was one of the first guys who did the Firewire DMA demonstration. Snare is a guy who did some early Thunderbolt exploration. I won't go through everyone. But yeah, all the tools that kind of led into this, as well as right now the folks who are working on it. Peter Estentemsky does some open source hardware. Aki9 and Dragon Mix are the two that are working on the PCI implementation. White Quark and Gaiatech are some prior art. And Dean helped out with a couple other side quests of PCI Express exploitation. And so that is Rethinking PCI DMA Attacks. Any questions? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Joe.
Yeah.
Everybody give him a hand.
I have some stickers.